Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. This is the third and final panel in a three-part series we're calling Deconstruction Masterclass. My name is Natalie Hennigan, and I'm the education manager at Rethos Places Reimagined, which is the host of this panel series. I'd like to introduce Rethos first. Next slide, Erin, please. Rethos is a regional nonprofit organization. We're headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota. We have an office in Winona, Minnesota, and soon to be office in Duluth. Our mission is to lead and inspire people to connect to places and promote community vitality. Essentially, what we do is we help people and their communities reuse old buildings. So our policy staff advocates for legislation at the state and federal level that make it easier to rehab buildings and reuse building materials. Our Main Street program works with communities all around the state to revitalize historic downtown districts and neighborhoods. And our education program teaches people how to repair and maintain old buildings. If you've taken a class from us recently, you know that our education program holds a strong focus and emphasis on reuse and sustainability. So we like to teach folks about basic repair techniques so that they can rely on their own skills and affordably fix up their homes and reuse the material that they already have, take good care of their homes so that they don't fall into disrepair. We host hands-on workshops and webinars and talks like this one all year round, and you can find all of our upcoming programs at rethos.org. Our panel series is funded in part by a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which we are very grateful for. Our past two panels, which were the previous two Wednesdays, are available for viewing on our YouTube channel and will soon be added to Rethos's website. So we will be sending out all three recording links in a follow-up email tomorrow. So you're welcome to rewatch or share with folks in your network. We have a couple reminders for today. We ask that the group stays muted throughout the presentations and discussion, and use the chat feature here in Zoom for any of your questions or comments or ideas or connections you want to make with each other. The first hour or so will be presentations from our panelists. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll have moderated discussion and questions from all of you. If you would like to turn on closed captions, you can click live transcript at the bottom right of your screen and then click on show subtitles. Once again, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. This is a great place to make connections across different sectors, folks who are clearly interested in something related to deconstruction, reuse, salvage, and preservation. So in our past two panels, we introduced the concept of deconstruction, what it is, what it looks like, why it's a good thing. And we talked about and featured efforts happening in Minnesota to make deconstruction a more common practice. We also talked about environmental impacts of our current waste management system, where demolition and tossing stuff in the trash is the easiest, cheapest, most accessible thing to do. So today we're talking about how deconstruction and preservation can work together. So you're going to hear from my colleague, Erin Hanafin Berg, the policy director at Rethos. Ian Anderson from Architectural Antiques, who should be showing up here shortly. Architectural Antiques is an amazing architectural salvage shop in Minneapolis. We also have Fitzie Heimdahl, who wears a lot of hats in the preservation world, both in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but is here today representing the Arcola Mills Historic Site near Stillwater, Minnesota. And finally, we'll hear again from Olivia Cashman with Hennepin County Environment and Energy, speaking about their innovative grant program. So I'm particularly excited about this panel. Preservationists know that even with strong protections and advocacy, historic structures still get torn down. And we also know there's a great demand for high quality reclaimed material in restoration and preservation projects. I'm of the belief that deconstruction can be a link between these two things, both slowing down the process of building removal to ensure that materials aren't lost and that property documentation can be thorough and careful, and also can increase access to a rich supply of historic materials. So I'm very excited for this group of experts to share their perspectives on this link, on this connection. With that, I will pass it off to Erin, who's going to kick us off. And Erin, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, excited to be here for this third and final Deconstruction Masterclass. I'm Erin Hanafin Berg. I'm the director of the Rethos Policy Institute and the public policy director here at Rethos. And the Rethos Policy Institute is a program division that we launched last November. And a couple caveats about it. One, it's a new program. So like all new programs, we start very incrementally at Rethos. We believe in a lot of little. That's the kind of mantra that we've absorbed through our Main Streets program. And so we kind of like cumulatively build our expertise and resources, and the Policy Institute is really no different. So the information that I'm going to share today is mostly amplifying other people's work. We haven't had the resources or the time to be able to dedicate to doing our own research yet, or to advance our own solutions necessarily. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to be sharing is just pointing to other people's really great examples, including the National Trust and some of the other cities that have been leading in deconstruction ordinances and other things like that. One of the things that I've been learning a ton through these last two sessions of deconstruction masterclasses as well. And one of the takeaways that I have gotten from this is, this notion that demolition is easy and cheap, and how that becomes our default, because it is easy and cheap. I also want to reference though that it's also loud. I happened to wake up last week one morning to my neighbor's garage being demolished. And I honestly thought that there was another thunderstorm coming through, because I heard this rumbling and I'm like, where is this rumbling coming from? And it was, before 8 o'clock in the morning. And I, went out and looked at the sky and I'm like, I don't see thunderclouds. I don't know what's going on. And then I realized, oh, our neighbor is finally moving forward with their garage construction project. And of course, the first step to a new garage in most cases is demolishing the old garage. And that rumbling noise went on all morning. This is for, a standard, probably early 20th century 2-car garage. And between the demolition and the hauling and the tossing of things into that big metal dumpster, it was a pretty loud racket, literally all morning long. And so while demolition is easier and cheaper than all of the other alternatives, than both deconstruction and preservation, I think it's really, the time is right for us to think about how we can make both deconstruction and preservation more affordable, and also more accessible. And maybe part of that is by making demolition a little bit harder and more expensive. One of the things that I kind of refer to a lot when I'm doing preservation work or working with folks all throughout the state and the country is that preservation takes intention. It's not something that happens by accident. It has really never been our society's default position. And so that means that somebody has to decide that they're going to pursue this course of action and put the resources and the energy, both literal and figurative, behind choosing to do a preservation project. So it takes intention, and it also sometimes just really takes a lot of time. These projects are really complex. It takes a lot of resources, to financial resources to pull it together. That usually takes a lot of time. And then of course, doing that painstaking work of getting things back into a state of usability is a bit by bit incremental process itself. And there's really no rushing that. And of course, there's all those unexpected problems that pop up that people have to counter that typically cause delays. One of the projects that has finally come to fruition after literally decades of vacancy and disrepair is the Fort Snelling Upper Post, which is being rehabbed right now as affordable housing for veterans primarily. And this is a project, that literally took from the time that people started talking about, like, we really should invest in these places. And this is a National Historic Landmarks, and with many layers of really compelling and important history behind it, from both Native peoples all the way through to the present day. How do we amass the resources to actually have these places preserved? That itself took about 15 years of just kind of like that, okay, we're committed to this, and how do we get it done? And of course, before that, it was vacant for 40 or 50 years and deteriorating. So time is never really on the side of preservation. But it's also, when you look at the alternative, how easily you can take care of that, the opposite, which is demolishing things, then we're already kind of like an imbalance of resources. So the other thing that had kind of struck me as I've been paying attention to the last couple of deconstruction master classes is there's these wonderful grants that are new available for deconstruction. But this is really more than has ever been available for rehab support in terms of rehabilitating older buildings. So, both Hennepin County and Ramsey County now have deconstruction grants available to property owners. And Olivia will tell us some more about that at the end of this panel. But home repair and building repair grants are really, really hard to come by. And they're usually very stringent criteria in terms of income qualifications and what you can use them for, and where your property has to be located, and all those kinds of things. When I first started at this organization back in 2008, my heart would sink every time somebody would contact us and say, hey, I have a historic house and I really want to restore it. Is there money available? And I would have to tell them, no, there's really not. So it's ironic a little bit to me that we now have these great programs for deconstruction support, but we really haven't matched any of those kinds of programs with the same level of rehabilitation support. And even, this where our state dollars go has typically been to that demolition or blight removal, as they call it a lot of times, even through the Minnesota DEED, which is Department of Employment and Economic Development. That's what it is. I have to get the E's in the right order. Those redevelopment grants, which have been around since 1998, have awarded a lot of projects, but they've been overwhelmingly demolition or some kind of like scrape off new site reconstruction. And that is, obviously causing things to be demolished and carted off to the landfill. So this hasn't really been an entrenched part of our state policy at all either, even though the counties are doing a pretty good job of thinking of that. And of course, we know from past deconstruction master classes here that the state, especially through the Pollution Control Agency, is thinking really intentionally about how to shift the tide and the tone in state government so that there's more resources that are preserved and reused through this. And ultimately, our policies reflect our priorities. So I'm heartened by the fact that deconstruction is becoming more of a priority, and it's clearly something that is that we're more and more people are interested in. And then, of course, the climate change is a huge priority because we can't avoid that any longer. Shout out to the National Trust, our sponsor for this series, because they've actually been involved in this kind of work for a long, long time, really trying to draw these links between preservation and climate change and climate resiliency, and in terms of all the kinds of support and information that they provide. They have things about disaster preparedness and really recovering from, catastrophic floods and all the other natural disasters that can happen. But they have also been really leading in terms of recognizing energy costs associated with building stock, and then the potential energy savings of rehabilitating that existing building stock. When they first launched it, it was called the Preservation Green Lab. It's now called the Research and Policy Lab at the National Trust. But their director, Jim Lindberg, has done a lot of really great research. And this is this quote that's here on the screen is from an article that he had published in a journal that was just came out the last year or so, really talking about these climate impacts of deconstruction, or of demolition rather, and how to mitigate climate change through preservation and reuse. And so I pulled out some of the kind of like most eye-catching stats just from this one paragraph about how 162,000 housing units are lost each year just due to demolition and natural disasters. That's a lot of, I mean, and especially ironic when we consider how much we hear about housing needs, and how we're have too few housing units anyway, and then here's all these ones that are being torn down. And then nearly 225,000 of the new houses that have been built have involved the tear down of an existing home. And how problematic that is when you're essentially tearing down something to replace it with something that's fairly similar. And we also have heard about this notion that demolition is not a sustainable practice because our landfills are finite, and we have to address that through the MPCA work and all of the deconstruction work that is being promoted here. So I also have been thinking about this iconic image. This is one of the National Trust's first forays into really trying to draw this connection between preservation and climate change. And this was from the 1980s. They had this ad actually that was publicized, a really compelling graphic. And I think I actually remember seeing this when I was a teenager and first really interested in preservation. So it goes way, way, way back, I can tell you. But this kind of like notion of this is a gas can of a building, not that it's consuming gas, but it's actually saving gas to reuse that. And so the trust has put a lot of effort into understanding that. And ultimately, we're recognizing that preservation and deconstruction are climate action, and hopeful that the message will finally catch on. One of the things that I was really heartened by over the last couple of years is that there has been some of kind of more in the popular press, and especially in the architectural press, there's been a lot of increased awareness of this kind of notion that buildings can be reused, that buildings can be deconstructed to be reused. The Pritzker Prize, which is like the architecture fields, like best picture nominee kind of thing, just last year gave their award to French architects who have kind of this mantra of never tear down, only build up. And so so that was, a really notable way to kind of like get the whole entire architecture field's attention around like, oh, we don't have to build sexy at a time. We can actually take serviceable buildings and reimagine how those can be used without demolishing things first. And then, there was this a lot of kind of architectural press about what if we never demolished another building, and then and reused things, and then even how to add some kind of architectural panache to the idea of salvaged and deconstructed materials. This is one that was referenced in some of these articles about a project in Copenhagen where they recognize that you can't, it's pretty hard to salvage individual bricks. It's really pretty labor intensive to kind of chip off all of that mortar and get them in a condition where they can be relaid in a brick wall. But if you took sound build brick facades or brick walls and took them off as panels, you could actually reconstruct them much like you're doing anyway with modern construction and modern architecture, where they're precasting panels and tipping them up on the facade of a building anyway. So that was really a pretty compelling notion, I thought. Granted, all of this stuff is happening in Europe, but let's hope that it catches on here soon. And one of the reasons that I kind of wanted to heighten this architectural thing is because that's where a lot of preservationists have come from. Typically, it's always been from that like architectural appreciation and, you know, what are the beautiful buildings, and those kind of design aesthetics, and recognizing that materials reuse and deconstruction can actually have a role in that design aesthetic is really, really important as well. The other thing that was brought up at one of the previous master classes is that it's all kind of what the clients are willing to pay for and what they're asking of their architects and of their contractors and other folks. And so I kind of wonder, like, well, if we're trying to meet the needs of clients, how do we make them do other things that will kind of like lead to more deconstruction opportunities, or more opportunities for building reuse? So one of the ways that has been happening is through deconstruction ordinances. And Portland, Oregon was really the first city in the country to adopt a deconstruction requirement. And their ordinance, when it went into effect in 2016, was for buildings that were built before 1916. So an easy 100-year mark, anything built before 1916, if it was proposed to be demolished, it actually had to be deconstructed instead. And then they actually expanded that ordinance in late 2019. So it went into effect in 2020, and applied that instead to buildings, houses or duplexes that were built before 1940 and earlier. And so one of the things that they recognized is, one, that deconstruction requirement that had already been in place had been pretty well received. They also realized that by expanding the kind of the range of time period, they would actually double the number of houses that could be deconstructed and you know, kept from contributing to the landfill. And they found that just over that first 3-year period, their ordinance resulted in the deconstruction of over 200 houses and 2.4 million pounds of material that were salvaged for reuse. So it was really helpful to have such clear metrics. Portland, as I said, was the first deconstruction ordinance. There's also one in place now in Milwaukee. It was kind of hard to find information about how well that's been received or what the actual metrics are on that. It sounded like actually it hadn't been enforced until fairly recently. You can see on there that the enforcement of the deconstruction ordinance will be stayed until March 1st of 2020, even though this was passed in 2018. So I don't know much about how well that's rolled out, and they didn't have nearly as snazzy graphics as other places. Baltimore apparently also has some deconstruction activity that they're promoting through city ordinances as well. There was an article here in the Pew website that I found, again, trying to amplify the work that's already been done out there and calling attention to all these great resources. And then actually the USGBC, which is the Green Building Council, which is typically not a great friend to preservation, frankly. Like all of the LEED stuff that they rolled out really did not take into account any of the value of building reuse or of building rehab in terms of, you know, achieving LEED status for whatever those things might be, especially at first. So the USGBC and preservation sectors have not been in close alignment, but they have actually put out a policy paper or this brief on deconstruction. I have the link here, and it'll be in the PowerPoint as it goes out to you guys as resources. But what I was really struck by is this is like a 3-page policy paper, and it actually kind of spells out, here are some things to think about if your community is interested in pursuing a deconstruction ordinance. So like, how do you calculate the impact up front? How do you make sure that there's an industry that's ready to respond to these deconstruction ordinances and the work that will be created? What do you do with all those materials? And then finally, how are you going to implement this? So I thought that was actually a really sound resource and one that we will definitely be taking and trying to share more broadly and kind of shop around. And then finally, I wanted to highlight a lot of the work that I've been doing. With them several years ago when they were really leading in cultural heritage identification and really trying to take preservation beyond just, here's a lovely building that we want to save, but like, what does this mean for people in our communities? And how can they identify assets that are important to them, even though those might not have the purest architectural value? But they've also been within their Office of Historic Preservation, which in itself I think is really, really cool that this is the city office that's charged with all these things, and they have recognized the value of this and they're creating those resources. They have this policy initiative that was really focused on the circular economy that we've already heard quite a bit about. It was led by a city councilman in 2017. And with all these great goals about developing a local workforce and deconstruction, making sure that there were high quality materials available to build, and that those were affordable to people to be able to use in their projects. They thought that this would really spur local business development, create this market for reused materials, and then of course achieve their sustainability goals. And they have developed this website called San Antonio Reuse. And of course, everything is branded with the city of San Antonio, which again, I just really admire the leadership that has recognized within their city government that this is something that is very worth doing. Their website, San Antonio Reuse, which is just really easy, sareuse.com, has a ton of resources on it for deconstruction and their salvage initiative. And then one of those resources that they have done is a very thorough report called Treasure in the Walls. They hired a consultant to do this. It was published just last year. You can see from the table of contents all the kind of content that has gone into that. The marketplace in San Antonio, economic environmental cost of loss, what the retail impact is, workforce development, demolition and public health, and then recommendations. And throughout this, there's sprinkled real great factoids and then kind of like profiles of practitioners from all across the country, people who are involved in the deconstruction movement. I am just putting some of their key findings up here on the screen. They have not adopted a deconstruction ordinance yet in San Antonio. And so that's the other thing that I think is really interesting, is that they're approaching this from a let's present all this information and do a lot of work out there to get people to buy into this, but we're not going to mandate it yet. And so I think that that's really interesting to show that, this is how they can incrementally, but intentionally build this resource and this path for sustainability within their community. And then again, be a model to the whole entire nation. And then I loved some of the facts and figures that were pulled out in this Treasure in the Walls report about how much salvageable materials have been landfilled every year since 2009 because of this linear waste stream that we've heard about. And then, they pointed out that in 2020, the demolitions that occurred that year could have alone potentially salvaged 5.8 million board feet of lumber, and that could have been reused to provide structural framing for 618 houses. And that was the equivalent of 7,700 mature trees. So just like putting it in real clear numbers that are visible, because frankly, 5.8 million board feet of lumber is an unfathomable amount for me. I just can't calculate that, but I kind of know what 618 houses looks like. And that's several square blocks of houses, right? They have a whole section in that report about the financial incentives and disincentives with grants, how to raise demolition permit fees, as I was talking about how to make it harder and more expensive to do demolition as opposed to deconstruction or rehab. And then what those tipping fees could be and when to allow for waivers. And then this was another part that I thought was really compelling, this arts and creative reuse section where they had a salvage to ADU program where they were talking about how you can salvage these buildings and then put them immediately back into use as ADUs. And here in the Twin Cities, at least, there's been so much talk about facilitating ADUs and adding density to our existing neighborhoods through construction of ADUs. And frankly, as somebody who would be interested in doing that, but just can't figure out how to make it work on my very, very small lot, I've been thinking about like, well, how do you incentivize that on other places where people do have, you know, maybe a slightly larger lot, but there's still all of these other kinds of like headaches to do that, including things like how do you run plumbing all the way to the back of your lot, and what's the cost associated with that? But if the materials were far more affordable and accessible through salvaged material, that makes a lot more sense. And frankly, it's kind of like adding historic elements back into potentially a historic district, for example, right? So like it can allow that historic district to evolve, but not to be out of character necessarily with what's there by using historic materials. So I have a couple videos that I want to share, but I'm going to have to like very clumsily switch around from one screen to another. So let me see if I can stop this share and go to the next one. We do not want. Hold on one sec here. I'm going to mutter to myself while I figure out how to do this because I've got to switch the screen. Sorry, I'm being very clumsy. All right, I think you will, and I'm gonna, this is close to 10D Zoom, right? Now I can't see anybody, so I don't know.
Erin, it's back to that sort of blurry situation that we were having before.
Of course, I can't get my thing to stop either. Hold on. Stop. All right, I'm sorry. I am like so confused by my screens right now. I can't even figure out like where I am. Let me, how about this? I'm gonna see if I can just skip ahead to the next presenter and figure out how to queue this up. And then we can, I'll share it and either share the links to the videos in the chat so that you all can watch, or I will figure out how to share them at the end. Does that make sense?
That sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being like such a dork. And I've got to figure out too how to like find, as I said, like find the video back or find my Zoom app back, because I've got like too many windows open on two screens, and I am quite literally lost.
The multiple monitors are great until they're not. And
yeah. And now it's just like, seriously, things are just like layered on top of each other and I literally don't know where I am. So I apologize. I'm going to stop whatever sharing I'm doing because maybe that'll help. Yes, that did help. Sorry. Keeping it as real as possible here,
that's
folks.
right. Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to move on to our next presenter, right?
That sounds great. Yeah. Fitzie Heimdahl. I'm so excited that Fitzie's here. Has a long history in the preservation community, both, like I said, in Minnesota and across the border in Wisconsin. Fitzie, I'm going to let you share a little bit about the work that happened at Arcola Mills, a really beautiful site near Stillwater, Minnesota, which for those not from the area, Stillwater is a gorgeous historic town on the St. Croix River with loads of residential and commercial historic properties, and this one is pretty special. So Fitzie, I'm going to let you go ahead, and hopefully Erin can find her screen and share again. Otherwise, I can do that too. But
good. Well, thank you, Natalie, and good morning, everyone. My name is Fitzie Heimdahl, as Natalie mentioned, and I will be talking primarily about a case study project with the Arcola Mills Foundation. We are a small, completely volunteer-run nonprofit. We're about 5 miles north of Stillwater. We own and manage about 55 acres of land. The natural habitat in the area is primarily hardwood forest, maple, basswood, oak, with numerous springs and seepages flowing from the hillsides directly into the St. Croix River. So we're situated on about half a mile of St. Croix Scenic Byway Riverway. And as part of that site, we also manage 2 historic sites. 2 of the structures on the site are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The 1847 John and Martin Maurer Mansion, as well as the ruins of the Arcola Mill lumber mill. The mansion, just briefly, if you can go to the next slide, Erin. We have some photos of the historic resources.
Fitzie, I'm trying. I'm just trying to figure
worries.
out how to get my thing to advance here.
It's
My
really
apologies. All right, hold on. I'm like having to juggle all this stuff around, and I am still really lost.
No worries.
I keep on like trying to restart things and relaunch.
Erin, I have the presentation up too. Why don't I share for Fitzie's portion? And
That would be really helpful, Natalie. Thank you.
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so I'll start just by talking a little bit about the site itself, and talk about how, you know, in our case, we did a kind of a mix of different methods of deconstruction, recycling, and salvage operation, instead of a typical demolition, throwaway in the landfill. And we'll go over all of that, including how it actually, in our case, it was cost effective. And, you know, as a small nonprofit with limited resources, this was, you know, in a way, the only way we could accomplish the project. So going back just a little bit about the history itself, the photo on the left is a photo of the John and Martin Maurer mansion. This was built in 1847, so we're celebrating the 175th anniversary of the site of the house. This is the largest timber frame house still standing in Minnesota. It's constructed entirely of white pine. That was, you know, virgin white pine cut from the woods of most likely northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, possibly even along the St. Croix Valley at the time. From the mid 1830s all the way up until the early 1900s, the St. Croix Valley was really a hub of the lumber industry, and each little village had at least one sawmill, oftentimes many more, that they would use to process and cut and treat the lumber, and really use the river as a highway for transporting that lumber as well. And Arcola Mills was just one of those industrial sites. I should mention, of course, that this site has been home to people for thousands of years, and there's certainly ample evidence of that. You know, whether it was seasonal dwellings, using the natural resources that are still very much abundant and rich on this site. People have certainly enjoyed and utilized the site for many, 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 many years. Obviously predating the physical structures you see here. Yeah, and it's also the third largest home, or the third largest house still standing in the state as well. Next slide, please. Perfect. So it's a site rich in you know, historical resources, but it's also a site that's very rich in natural resources as well. And as I said, we manage 55 acres entirely preserved through a conservation easement. And that includes at least 8 springs and creeks that originate on the property and flow directly into the river. So maintaining the site and having a sustainability focus is obviously a big component of our organization. When the mansion was built in the mid 1840s, all the way up until about 1900, 1910 is when we say the first era of the site's history occurred, really the lumber era, the industrialization, the commercialization of the site and the riverway. After that, the mansion itself fell into a period of decline and abandonments all the way up until the mid 30s, when the previous owners, Catherine and Henry Van Meyer, a local couple from the Stillwater area, kind of stumbled upon it. Henry Van Meyer was a local doctor, and he used a lot of homeopathic remedies using plants and their native medicinal values to treat patients. And that's how they discovered this site, in a decrepit state. And in 1935, they acquired this site, and over the decades, they acquired a series of structures. A total of, at one point, 11 structures were on the site. And these were home to artists, these were home to family, friends, community members, where they would kind of open up their property and allow others to access the river and access this beautiful place, really as a source of inspiration. They lived there. Dr. Henry Van Meyer died in about 1979, and his wife died in the early 90s. And so during that period, the site again kind of fell into a period of decline. Some maintenance wasn't being maintained in the mansion. Obviously, people weren't living in these outbuildings, and so they deteriorated over the time. And really in the mid 90s and early 2000s, when Catherine Van Meyer passed away, she put it in her will to preserve this property and preserve the mansion and preserve all these unique features, and really create a foundation to be able to restore them and to be able to allow access to visitors to this wonderful and quite honestly magical sites. So the first phase of major restoration work on the mansion occurred in the mid 2000s, a multi-million-dollar restoration project to bring the house back to some of its original character, really maintaining the original features of the house while repurposing it into more of a visitor center, event center where you could do different events and potentially overnight retreats. So really focusing on that. And in the last couple of years, the board's impetus has been to look at the cabins. These are structures that have been sitting on site and in a state of abandonment for well over 40 years. And, they were built and quite honestly acquired to be used as seasonal dwellings. The board took every effort to try to preserve these sites. We did a survey to determine whether they might be eligible for inclusion on the site's National Registry designation. When it was found that they weren't necessarily eligible, that's kind of when the focus shifted on, now that we don't have a potential fund to save these structures, what are we going to do to remove them? And that's where this process began. And these are some photos of some of the structures. This here is actually a houseboat that was used on the river. We believe it was built in the mid 1920s, actually in the Stillwater, a boat manufacturer in Stillwater. And we think it was moved on site somewhere around the 1950s or 1960s. Next slide, please. This structure is actually a conglomeration of a series of structures that were kind of pieced together. We think that at least one of these structures was also moved from a different site. And there's rumors that it might have actually been a roadside chicken stand. Doing some research from folks in the area and some evidence, we found that might have been its prior use before becoming a seasonal cabin in the river. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple of the other structures that were on site, and just showing you the general disrepair and the condition they were in. Where the board had to make a decision in terms of having a safe and accessible site to visitors, while trying to get rid of these properties in a way that is both sustainable and economically feasible for the foundation, of course. And so that's really where this efforts and the initiative came, to try to do this as creatively as possible. And looking at a way that we could minimize the environmental impact as well. And we did this through a variety of methods. We can go to the next slide. We have a few videos as well. A lot of it's, this is also, so this one was a unique dilemma where you've got a historic ruin with a non-historic structure built on top of it. So extra care needed to be taken in the removal of this structure and for the preservation and eventual restoration of the mill ruins. That's a project that will be coming up through the foundation as well. So as I said before, we did this through a variety of methods. The first being, of course, salvage operations. These, even though the cabins themselves weren't deemed historic, they had a lot of intrinsic value for members of the community, and in a way that could have led to inaction of doing this project sooner. And so we really wanted to open up the invitation to people who had stayed in these cabins. A lot of time, a lot of folks who had previously stayed in the cabin now currently live in the valley, Marina, St. Croix, or Stillwater. So any folks that we knew had a connection to these cabins, we opened an invitation to pretty much come out and salvage what they wanted. Take a little personal memento of their stay. I mean, they have a lot of fond memories, and so we wanted to, of course, open it up to them first and let them have first dibs on any material or items that might be of value to them. From there, we opened it up to the wider community. We honestly, from our point of view and from a small nonprofit, we opened this up as an opportunity for salvaging materials in local marketplaces through Facebook and Craigslist. And we ended up getting quite a bit of interest. I would say surprisingly more than we generally anticipated and expected. But I think this just comes to show that there is a real value of some of these materials, even if it isn't the highest quality old growth material. This wood is still old, and it still has value, especially as commodity prices are as they are today. And so, we were able to salvage quite a bit of in particular, the paneling and the trim and the siding of that houseboat inside. A lot of windows were salvaged for reuse. There was still some furniture inside these structures that were reused as well as bricks, rocks, everything. Even the boards from that hull and the hull itself were reused for other projects. We had folks come down who took the rest of the hull and we're going to use it for actually a deck project up in their cabin in northern Minnesota. And so using that and trying to salvage as much as we could before we brought in crews to bring the structures down was our first goal. And when we took that route and utilized it the most we could, we brought in a company called Atomic Recycling, which they're really a leader in waste management recycling in the Twin Cities. So we used them to try to recycle as much of the debris as we could as well. And we actually had a bit of an on-site salvage operation where we actually took the metal components as well, and we took those to a recycling center, a separate recycling center as well, to recycle and actually to get some of the funds back just in terms of the metal products. So next slide, please. This is a video.
Okay,
Kind
tell
of
me if it doesn't
D
look
by
good.
eye type of project.
We'll try it.
All right, on the count of 3. One, 2, 3. Wow. Something.
And then there's one more video on the next slide as well.
All right, on the count of 3. That's a wrap. Well, almost.
So that's us salvaging some of the metal from that houseboat. And next slide. Yeah, so as I said before, it's, demolition is often thought as kind of the cheaper and easier way. And, there certainly was some more work on board members' time in terms of this project, but it really did pay off in terms of the total breakdown in costs. So, originally the board had allocated $7,000 to the removal of these 4 cabins, small structures on the site. And this is a breakdown of the costs associated with it. We got some in-kind work with the heavy equipment and excavators as well. And we were able to actually generate some funds through salvage operations and recycling as well. So with in-kind donations, we received about a little over $2,000 just in in-kind donations, and we raised about $3,135 entirely through the salvage operations, which meant that the total cost out of pocket to our foundation was a little over $3,800, which is pretty incredible for demolishing 4 structures. And what I really want to say about this is, there is a market, and there really is, it's not necessarily cheaper to just go the traditional demolition, throw everything in the landfill route, not only in terms of the societal impacts and environmental impacts, but in terms of our foundation in particular, it really did make sense to try to do this in a way that was more environmentally friendly as well as fiscally, financial, and responsible too. And I'll also just mention too, so besides being on the board of this nonprofit, I'm also in City of Stillwater Heritage Preservation Commissioner. And even though we don't necessarily have a deconstruction ordinance, we do have pretty stringent demolition ordinances on the book in the City of Stillwater. And so if for whatever reason a demolition does come up, we try to heavily emphasize the use of deconstruction and reuse whenever possible, looking at the resources that are available in Washington County, which does have some financial incentives available, but really just trying to, 1, make it more environmentally friendly, and 2, putting these extra teeth to making the demolition work less easy and more rigorous for applicants to take when they do a typical project on their home.
Thank you so much, Fitzie.
Mhm.
I'm going to pause here. Excellent. Oh gosh, and thanks for putting in the Arcola Mills website too, so that folks can check out. I think it's such a beautiful site and an awesome and creative solution you all came up with to figure out how to best care for that site and make it useful in the future. So thank you for that. We're going to pass it off to Ian Anderson, who is here from Architectural Antiques. And I see he's showing off some architectural antiques, which is awesome. So I think last week in our session, a couple questions came up about best places to sell or donate some historic materials. A lot of us in care of historic properties that are full of historic materials. And I think Ian can answer a lot of questions about that process. But Ian, I'm going to let you share a bit about architectural antiques and your work and the role of these phenomenal salvage shops in the deconstruction and preservation world.
Wonderful, thank you. I will have my face for a couple minutes here and then I'll switch back to the hardware because I don't have any slides. So yeah, as I said, my name is, or as Natalie said, my name is Ian Anderson. No Jethro Tull references in the chat, please. And I run a company called Architectural Antiques. We are located in Northeast Minneapolis off Quincy Street. The company has been around for over 40 years now, and it's a small family business. Prior to that, the myth is that it started as a company called Scroungers that was basically, it had a little, there's a little storefront on, I believe it was Lindale. And it was just kids diving in dumpsters and then renting out what they found to theater departments for props. So that's a bit of our heritage, and we've grown and changed over the years. A lot of evolution happens in this business. Trends change, and then what we have available to us to purchase changes. So I'm going to switch back to this hardware here. Yeah. All right. So we focus on what are basically turn of the century American architectural elements, or antiques, as you'd like to call them. This, as I describe it, is basically anything antique that is attached to the home. We tend to stay away from more traditional antique shop antiques, things that are movable. So we have a heavy focus in lighting and door hardware and doors themselves, windows, stained glass windows, some trim, and then built-in units, built-in woodwork. I usually tend to say the bread and butter of our business is the traditional built-in in Minneapolis. There's a variety of different styles, but these really were in so many homes. We tend to focus on higher end pieces, but really anything that falls into that category has an element of quality to it, and we prefer to allow that quality to stand out. What you see in front of you is just a quick example of the variety of hardware found in turn of the century homes. These are not obviously all from the Twin Cities area, but probably many of the styles similar to this were present. Within our business, I would say right now, the main focus is lighting and hardware, as you can see, as we call house jewelry. These are the two areas of antique elements that we will do some refurbishment on. We will do cleaning and then bringing up to working order. So most of the lighting we sell is entirely refurbished. We will run all new wire, clean and refinish appropriate areas. We will adjust length and allow the light to leave our shop basically hangable in your home. We do some building materials and some other woodwork items. Sorry, I've lost the plot for a second. What sort of drives, I guess I would say, as I said, we are a for-profit business, but I think what drives our motivation on what we choose to bring into our shop, other than really the sort of initial metrics that I mentioned, is we operate under this fundamental belief that within salvage, within reintegration or repurposing, focusing on items like this can allow anyone to bring an element of architectural heritage into their own home. The homes themselves really do stand out, especially within Minneapolis, but most American cities, at least going further east of here. In the Twin Cities here, I know we all can recognize the bungalow, four squares, Spanish Revival, Tudor Revival, that were working class homes that are prevalent everywhere, that are not just the homes in Kenwood that are massive, but these do litter most blocks within the cities and do stand out and let us see a bit of that history integrated throughout the whole of the city. And obviously we will not all be able to live in those homes. They're not building more, but we want to provide anyone with the opportunity to come in and take a small piece, if nothing else, and put it into their own home. And I think this touches on a little bit of the fundamental issue of preservation, which is trying to keep up something that does feel like it's a bit against the grain, against the current, in a world that is moving faster, that is focused on efficiency, that is focused on making things cheaper. That is a movement that is very hard to push against. So I operate under the belief that doing that in small areas and believing in and valuing the history in whatever portion we do, whether it's to reintegrate a whole room into your new home, or whether it's simply to put value on the hardware that's there, or a single light fixture that's there that brings the unique style and the unique craftsmanship back. I think I'm going to switch back to my face so that it might help me focus more. You can all look at it. Couple more things I want to say is that, in my opinion, I have a personal love for this turn of the century design. I do think that there is an element of, within our sort of manufacturing history as a country, where there's a level of confluence of both design, craftsmanship, and function that came together at this point where that hasn't happened since, and not before, because of the manufacturing process being less robust. But in this era, there are the styles that are happening are pushed forward because of competition within these different manufacturers, within door hardware, within lock creation, within lighting, that rather than what is happening now, which is sort of efficiency and low price being the driving competition that allows companies to succeed, there it was design, creating a new idea, creating a new trend, and manufacturing something that was beautiful and consistent. And this part of what makes this era so long living in its aesthetic. That, in combination with the materials that are used and the craftsmanship put into things. Most of this hardware that I was showing, most of the lighting that we deal with are created out of brass, created out of bronze, plated in nickel. Iron was used for sure, but these are materials that don't experience the same amount of corrosion as thinner materials, and they were used in larger quantities. There's an abundance of cast pieces that have a large amount of material, and as you can see in this hardware, this is all basically just a copper-based alloy. It's brass and bronze, and yet the coloration, and this is just over time aging, the coloration is different throughout. The nuance that comes out in these pieces is, I mean, I could look at these and you could find little details for no matter how long you look at them to see the differences. And that allows whatever piece we salvage or we promote reuse of to be unique, to be something that stands out. And I think I see this even within every light that comes into our store. I've been doing this almost 8 years, and I still see, when I have someone reach out or we go to a salvage, I am continually surprised by the uniqueness of the individual pieces that we see. There are themes that certainly emerge, but rarely do I see an identical match to a previous light that I'd seen. These things that were created for so many houses were unique in their own individual way. This would give anyone looking to put a light in their house an opportunity to have a standout piece that is unique and also antique. I think the other thing is that I will mention quickly is just that through the craftsmanship in these pieces, that you can see the historical trends. You can see elements of Victorian hardware. You can see elements of Art Nouveau and elements of the arts and crafts movement within each piece. And they're also connected to the homes that they're a portion of. So if you find yourself in a position to be in a home that has this, you can see that the consistency of the home, from the exterior design all the way down to the hardware, adds a level of consistency throughout. And I think I'll have one final small thing to say here, and that's to return to the idea of these turn of the century homes. To echo on what Erin was saying a little bit, which is that the preservation and care, whether it's reuse or whether it's continuing use, does require an element of intentionality, and an element there is an element of cost associated, which is why the intentionality is so important, because those costs can be valued for that, or at least seen as worthwhile. And I think that applies to larger scale work, such as, you know, whole home deconstruction, or you know, how we look at the grants that are provided so that large numbers of people can do this, but it also applies to individual homeowners. And while we are one resource, there are resources out there. You have to dig a little bit, but for you as a homeowner, your space, if you're willing to give it that intention, most of these things were designed not to be thrown away, but to be maintained. And it does require more of a focus than our current sort of break it, replace it system, but the knowledge is out there. I mean, one thing that we end up doing quite a bit for people is, if not fixing their mortise locks. I'm sure many of you that have lived in old homes know the finickiness of an old, you know, 4-inch mortise lock cassette. But this is something that we will do, but we will also, you know, many people that come in have a whole house full of these things that they would like to care for. So if we don't fix them, we will talk with each individual person that comes in about this hardware and help them decipher what needs to be done. And there's many of the other salvage companies in the area will do some of that as well. We all end up having our own unique focuses, but many of the people in this business love these things and are completely willing to chat with you if you have an interest in bringing that revitalization to your own home. I think that I will wrap it there and save more for any discussion or questions we have.
Thank you so much, Ian. I really like what you said about, you know, we think a lot about the value, the quality of materials coming from older buildings. We talk about old growth wood and high quality metals and all of that, but you said something interesting kind of about the values of the time in which those things were created, and how that sort of imbued through the way we construct, the way we source our materials, and all of that is lost when we move away from that style of construction, or we move away from caring for those buildings to begin with. So thank you for that. That was wonderful. We are going to pass it off to Olivia Cashman, who spoke at our first panel discussion about Hennepin County's efforts to support more deconstruction activity. And Olivia is going to share a little bit about a particular element of their grant program that is new and very exciting, if I do say so myself. And after Olivia's a little bit, we're going to take a break and come back with questions. So please do feel free to add any of your thoughts for any of the speakers, for each other, into the chat, so that we can kick off a discussion as soon as we get back from our break. And I think, all right,
I'm trying this again. Can you see the slides now?
Thank you.
Yep, I see them.
Awesome, thank you.
Am I good to start?
Yes, for Olivia, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, I am Olivia Cashman. I'm with Hennepin County's Department of Environment and Energy. And like Natalie said, I spoke in more detail about our grant program at the first session a couple weeks ago. But I just wanted to talk briefly about our expansion of our deconstruction grant program. And one of the elements of the expansion is a grant program that incorporates used building materials back into projects. So I'll talk more about that. Next slide, please. It's a little fuzzy, but essentially this slide is just explaining the 4 different tiers of our grant program. So the first tier is the deconstruction for residential properties, which we've had up and running for about 2 years now and have had a lot of good feedback and different projects done, about 26 projects completed. And then we are expanding to have commercial deconstruction projects funded, as well as full structural moves. And then the program I wanted to kind of talk in more detail about is this used building material installation funds. So next slide, please. Awesome. So I'm really excited to talk about this specific grant with the group today because this provides up to $5,000 per project for property owners that want to incorporate used or salvage building materials into their either addition, renovation, remodel, or new construction. So I think it's really interesting. The topic or the name of today's session is Giving Life to Old Buildings, which I think is super true. And I think this grant kind of twists that a little bit by also bringing some old touches into new buildings or new designs too. And I think kind of that circular approach and of supply and demand is needed as we kind of look to continue the momentum around used building materials. So our deconstruction funds are kind of helping on that supply side by funding projects that deconstruct and bring those materials into the marketplace. And we're really hoping that these funds push the bar to increase demand for used building materials and help folks make that decision to shop, use, and incorporate those pieces into their project. So again, we have $5,000 per project. The website will be launching hopefully by end of this week. We're working hard to get everything updated so that we can start reviewing projects that come in. And we do have some criteria that I'll talk about. So we'll require 5 different interior fixtures be incorporated into the project design. So that includes items like plumbing, so sinks, vanities, tubs, toilets, kitchen cabinets or bathroom cabinets, light fixtures, and then we'll also, and a few more items that we have more details on our website. And then a second category for lumber requiring 500 pounds of either wood beams, wood flooring, joist, dimensional lumber, or other materials as approved by the county. But we kind of have that as more of a lumber focus and wanting to get some more waste diversion in that category. So for where you could source materials, we don't have a specific list of material vendors necessarily, but we would love for folks to shop locally at salvage shops such as Architectural Antiques that Ian just talked about. We would also allow sourcing from online platforms like Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, but we will vet that to make sure that materials are coming from viable sources and not, from an online retailer that's not sourcing these items as used, as that's kind of the whole point of the program. So yeah, that's a little bit more information about our building reuse grant expansion. I would be happy to talk to anyone more that has questions or just wants to discuss the program. Again, stay tuned for our web updates. If you would like to be added to an email list to kind of be the first to see when that application launches, feel free to send me your email either in chat here on the Zoom, or you can send me an email to my address listed. But thank you so much for the opportunity to, again, talk about this program. We're very excited and love that this topic was presented today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivia, and thanks for that caveat, adding old stuff to new buildings. I think that's important. And I know, like Erin mentioned too, a lot of conversation is happening in the architecture field about designing buildings for deconstruction, so that, or utilizing salvage materials that can carry on lives in a variety of different buildings. So we are going to take a quick break, come back at 11:30 Central if you're not in Central Zone. And go get your water, whatever you need, and we'll come back at 11:30 for a conversation. I have questions for all of our panelists, and I hope you do too. So we'll have a nice discussion for the last half hour. Yeah, 11:30. Thanks.
Hey, Natalie.
Yes.
I'm gonna put the link to this video that I was gonna show in the chat, and maybe encourage people to watch it on their own rather than try to figure out how to screen share it. But it also kind of picks up on that whole theme of reusing building materials in new construction. In this particular video, he talks about that ADU construction and salvaging things for the renovation of a house. So it's a kind of a good caveat.
Thank you. Perfect. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to dive into some questions for the last little portion of our time together. Again, I encourage everybody to throw any questions you may have of our speakers in the chat. And Erin also mentioned she put a link to the video from her presentation here. And this is a video that San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation put together. That's a really excellent connection between deconstruction and cultural heritage. So thanks, Erin, for that. I also want to mention too that we'll share the slide deck with everybody after the event today, and I'll include any of the links that have popped up in the chat. So you don't have to worry about copying and pasting them or anything like that. So one thing I wanted to kick us off with is, Fitzie, you said something very interesting about the opportunity for folks who had had some connection to the Arcola Mills site have first dibs, essentially, at salvaging or being part of the deconstruction and recycling happening at the site. And it made me think of how in the preservation world, when a community, a neighborhood is faced with the removal of a place that matters to them, oftentimes there is this mourning period. And, you know, folks are often encouraged to have a memorial service or honor that place, that lost, you know, heritage, that lost gathering space, whatever it is, somehow. And I wonder if you, maybe Erin as well, anybody, you know, wants to speak to how this careful removal of materials, the careful, you know, intentional reusing of materials can help us sort of go through that loss, that mourning period a little bit more easily, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah. So I can say that at first there definitely was some hesitancy to really share the project and open it up. And I think that really led to inaction in general. But what we found is that I think, you know, they expressed emotion on site, of course, and they shared some of their stories of their stays on sites. And I think overall it ended up being a positive experience, and we did get some donors after that as a result of that too.
Yeah, if I can chime in I can think of a couple instances where I think that the opportunity for deconstruction would have really helped heal some of those really hurt feelings from things. And one was in the example here in St. Paul a couple of years ago. There was a very, very fraught battle over St. Andrew's Church in the Como Lake neighborhood. And actually there had been another building on that site that had been removed earlier when the German immersion school first acquired that property. It was a Catholic church and school, and had a rectory or whatever the parish house is, that the priest lives in. Not Catholic, I don't know those things, but at any rate, that building actually had been deconstructed by Better Futures. And so it was a brick building with tile roof, had come down. And, I think that there was a little bit of consternation about it, but it didn't rise nearly to the level that it did over the removal of this church. And I know that there were some pieces of it that were salvaged, but I'm just kind of thinking of, like if there had been a deconstruction process followed in the church removal. One, back to that whole time piece, like people need time to grieve things. And sometimes those shouldn't happen and people were very clearly, very, very connected to this place. I mean, like I saw when it was nominated to the National Register, which was kind of almost like a posthumous nomination at that point, because it was known that the building would be demolished, but people were crying in the hearing. Like there was a lot of just really, really hurt feelings. And so thinking back to that timepiece that, it's deconstruction is quieter, it's softer, there's not a violent act being committed like there is with the demolition of a building using mechanical equipment. And so I think that in some ways, like you don't really want to have to start from a preservation perspective of, well, we'll allow demo or deconstruction because that would be, you know, an okay alternative, because usually when people are engaged in you know, advocating for a place, they really do want to see it preserved. So, but how do you kind of like allow for that deconstruction as an alternative to demolition if it's going to come to that? The other case that I was thinking about was, had just kind of like occurred to me as I was thinking about this last night, was that over in Minneapolis on Lake Street, there had been a building that had been altered quite extensively over the years, but it was acknowledged to be the original home of, or one of the earlier homes of, the Burma Shave Company, which was, you know, I mean, it was you know, created like shaving cream and stuff like that, but they had these really, really clever ads, roadside signs, and, you know, like little poems about Burma Shave that were constructed. And they were like these very iconic red signs that you would see aligned along the highway, kind of like that would unfurl in order and spell out a poem, and people would, like, you know, submit their ideas for these poems and stuff. Anyway, so it was this kind of like whole cultural phenomenon, as well as an advertising, you know, gimmick, turned like huge. And then there was this place associated with it. So people were trying to recognize, like, hey, this is kind of the home of modern advertising right here at this Burma Shave building, and it should be, you know, preserved. Well, it wasn't. It was found to be not architecturally or historically significant in its current condition, and so it was demolished. And as the wrecking ball was coming in, and, you know, like, there was this heap of rubble, sure enough, this Burma Shave sign kind of like sifts to the top, and people can see it right there. And so back to the deconstruction aspect of it, like, if that building had been deconstructed as opposed to demolished all at once, there might have been actually the opportunity to salvage some of those really iconic pieces of that building's history in a way that would have allowed them to be preserved. But as it was, like, these things were splintered and buried in the rubble, and, you know, carted off to a landfill. So.
Excellent examples, thank you. When my childhood grade school was torn down, I had a friend go and collect some bricks that I still have in my house because it meant a lot to me. And so I'm familiar with that urge. We have a couple questions popping up in the chat. Kathy asked a few, assuming that 2x4s from an old building are actually 2 inches by 4 inches. If they're salvaged, can they be milled down to today's dimensions? Which is a good question, and anyone can chime in to answer that. She also asks, how does one locate salvage companies, especially outstate? I might have an answer for that. And how does one market salvaged materials? I think in theory you could mill down just about anything, but I don't know how common of a practice that is, or time consuming, or yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that one, but I don't know if anybody on our panel would know.
You know, I was going to point out, I think in that video that I linked, there's actually a segment where the guy who's, you know, kind of narrating the video shows the difference, or how dense the old growth wood is, and shows the saw burn marks on that wood, because, you know, one, it's older, denser wood, and then it's, you know, essentially like antiqued itself. So it's like really, really, really hard. So I think that, you know, the milling might be a little bit problematic. It depends on like how you're going to do it, right? Because if you are trying to do it with your backyard skill saw, that might be, one, more dangerous than you're expecting, and two, like more expensive, because you're going to burn through a lot of saw blades because of the density of the wood. But I think in theory it could be. I know that somebody either on one of these panels or at one of our Buildings on Main panels, Natalie, had mentioned that structural reused lumber needs to be regraded to be structurally used for places that are going to be inhabited. Doesn't need to happen with a garage, for example, that's not an inhabited structure, but like if somebody's going to live in it, then you need to make sure that the lumber is up to the current grading standards before it can be reused. And I honestly don't know what that process is, but I would think that some of that, and it also kind of depends on, like, well, if you're building an entirely new structure but using salvaged wood, it doesn't need to be like current 2x4 dimensions, because it would all be consistently dimensioned. So I guess there's part of that kind of thing too, is like how much inconsistency would you have between new materials, old materials, different ages of old materials, to see how standardized that lumber actually is. That might go more to pointing out that there's aspects of this happening practically that we're not at yet, right? Like we just don't have the industry know-how that I know of, although Olivia was just about to chime in, maybe she does, to be able to like make this happen at scale because of all of those other things that have to happen between getting the material and reusing it.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is that I heard recently from folks over at Wood from the Hood that the Urban Wood Network, which was a national nonprofit, more focused on issues related to tree waste, but I think they were also incorporating some used like dimensional lumber in this as well, but looking at kind of a policy guide for folks to put in used wood into buildings. I'm not sure exactly where that's at, but I can put their website in the chat if folks are interested in kind of looking at that work. And then I also included someone, I think it was Christine, also asked about where to find salvage organizations. So I included a list on our website that we have of places in the Twin Cities. And I believe the MPCA has a list as well. And I think Natalie, you were going to share one as well, but yeah, that's what I have.
Yeah, Rethos does have a rehab resources webpage that includes regional collections of salvage shops and also some like weatherization and energy resources, which are very regional or county focused. We're working on building that up, though. It is hard to find as much information through greater Minnesota, but also Melissa threw in the chat a bit earlier this all for reuse crowdsourced map, which includes, it's intended to include anybody in this reuse, preservation, deconstruction world, and particularly feature these businesses to connect you to those resources that you need. So couple different options. I also think that, you know, I enjoy going for long drives and stumbling upon antique stores in small towns. And a lot of those folks source their material or the stuff they're reselling from, you know, flea markets that aren't available, that you can't Google and find, or that you can't, you know, aren't on Facebook or whatever. So it's a lot more like word of mouth connections that keep a lot of this stuff being reused and resold in greater Minnesota or Wisconsin. So anyway, okay, we have a couple more questions popping up here. And I hope, Kathy, all of that info is helpful. I know Rethos's window classes are filling up quickly. And if we had a few more, of a lot of things, we could do more classes. I know there's another one happening in October that you should sign up for because it's fresh. I know the next couple ones are full already. They're very popular. We did create, actually with Fitzie's help, we created a series of window repair videos that are available on our website and YouTube channel. Taught by one of our go-to window repair instructors, Laura Leppink. Nothing, you know, I understand nothing can replace the experience of being in person and having an instructor looking over your shoulder as you're learning repair techniques. But the information in the videos is a really good start, and you can pause and rewind as much as you want, which is a helpful thing too. So we're trying to build out more of those resources to have more at-home learning opportunities. But I know we're hopeful we can have more of these classes because there is such great demand for them. Let's see. Thanks, Madeline, for sharing that example. I think there are a lot of very interesting commemoration, interpretation, things we can do for properties that are being torn down. Molly asked a great question. Do any of you have advice on how to bridge the gap between all or nothing approach to historic preservation? When a project does not meet Secretary of Interior standards, many preservationists see deconstruction as a loss and have a hard time supporting it.
I feel like our company and similar salvage companies that deal in individual items do fall in the middle of this. I would say like every individual person, you have preservations of individual preservations are going to have different standards for what's acceptable, and we all have different sort of standards for what defines this. I would encourage all of us to have to advocate for as much preservation as possible, but also to like find the broadest possible view of positives that are happening to like celebrate those. We as a company have been on, we have found ourselves in that middle ground. We have been on sites on the other side of the picket line, if you will, where people are fighting against the demolition of this building. And so it might be weird for me to be part of this and still be there, but I do think that while advocating for saving as much and valuing the historical portions or historical buildings, society progresses whether we like it or not. And so finding those, that the things that are saved and celebrating those, I would say, is part of that middle ground.
I was going to say, I think Ian kind of like hinted at what I was going to say. Another one of my little pithy sayings is that preservation is a spectrum condition. Like we all come in at different places on that. And frankly, in different circumstances, we come in different places of that too. And so, I think allowing for there to be, some thoughtful assessment of, okay, can this building be saved? Can it be repurposed? Can it actually contribute in its current condition, or is there some alternative to that? And would salvaging those materials, deconstructing that building, allow at least one goal, which is to keep usable materials out of the landfill, to be accomplished there? And yeah, like when you kind of like make that switch to, okay, is this a building salvage effort or a building preservation effort? Where do you kind of come into that? That's going to be on a case by case, community by community, building by building basis, and have a lot to do with a lot of factors that are frankly like outside of people's control sometimes. That's a lot of it comes down to money and influence and who makes the decisions, and kind of just trying to figure out how to be there when you can be there to save places that are valuable, and of course like respect the needs and wishes of the community too. So.
Fitzie mentioned a little bit briefly about being a Heritage Preservation Commissioner, and when they're seeing case by case, situation by situation decision making in a community, you can offer a tailored approach, I think. And I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think that was what you were describing, how the city of Stillwater can encourage a particular method of removal that might include deconstruction, that might include some other interpretation, that isn't just we're tearing this down and you have to deal with it and move on. There is some grayness in the middle there, and I don't know if you can add to that at all too, but I think that HPCs, Heritage Preservation Commissions, which, for those of us not in the preservation world, play a really important role in local preservation decision-making, reviewing projects, reviewing changes that are proposed to properties within historic districts or that are historically designated. Historic preservation or heritage preservation commissions can play a really important role in adding more nuance to the conversation, I think. Sorry, Fitzie, I didn't just keep talking.
The reason I really wanted to, one of the reasons I really wanted to highlight work of the San Antonio traditional framework of here's a city agency who's charged with historic district designation and review and approvals and all the other kinds of things that HPCs and historic preservation offices are typically charged with. And yet they're also doing all of this other really great work. And so I think one of the things that this Deconstruction Masterclass hopefully has taught everybody who's involved in it has been like, you can do different things. You can, as Molly says, we can push the envelope or try to make some progress in different areas. And it is long work, but so, you have to kind of keep pushing those boundaries to make change happen. That's where the change happens, not by being all in one place. And so, I think if heritage preservation commissions could be more open to deconstruction as an alternative, or where on the spectrum of those secretary standards does this property really need to fall? Does it need to be a pure restoration? Do we need to hold things to that highest standard? And frankly, like there's the structures that we have in place do not allow for a lot of that kind of gray area, but where those local decisions are being made is like the best opportunity for that to happen. Some of the slides that I didn't get to show because I got so flummoxed by having to switch things were, you might be a preservationist if that's a game that we play occasionally in the Rethos office. Something will come up. You might be a preservationist if this happens, or if you think this. And I think, I would challenge all of the people who have participated in this Deconstruction Masterclass to think of themselves as preservationists now, which is probably not where some of them have come from. But, I think if you value historic building materials and think that there's an opportunity for them to be reused, that's a preservation activity. And you might be a preservationist if you think deconstruction is pretty cool.
Can I chime in here really quick with a quick anecdote and encouragement, because I do appreciate the question about and I personally have wanted to take the Rethos's window repair class, and I haven't gotten in yet. But my quick anecdote is I did a delivery the other day to just a young couple that had a home over in St. Paul that they were a historic Victorian home, beautiful. It needed some work, but the bones were good, and they are putting that work in. They are going through each part of the house and trying to revitalize it. And the little nugget in there is that this was a house that Amelia Earhart had spent time in as a child, and which is thrilling to learn, and they're super excited about it. And the point of this anecdote is that one other thing we can do is continue to educate ourselves and the people around us and encourage that education about how to maintain and care for these homes, these buildings. They do require continuous care, and that won't go away. And the level to which we can find these gems and value them will be part of our own societal, but our own individual, like the addition of that understanding of how to maintain these places. The difficulty of this conversation is an example of, or just like how to deal with this stuff. I mean, there is not going to be, the companies that are out there, we try to do our best, but there isn't going to be somebody to swoop in, to step in and provide the maintenance, provide all of that information in one go, or all of that expertise in using these things. So it's all of our individual understanding of how to take advantage of that. And I don't have a list, but this is why Rethos is here, and I'm super appreciative of all of you and what you're doing. So.
Thanks, Ian. I had a quick question for Olivia, actually, because I have participated in some of the stakeholder engagement Hennepin County has been doing to solicit feedback and ideas on the grant program and its zero waste plan generally. And so given that this new iteration of the grant program, came out of some like learning after the first version, I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to how you've been trying to get feedback on this grant program, how it expanded, and maybe where the future is, back to Erin's point that you kicked off with, that maybe we can get more grants back in the world for just fixing up old buildings.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And we, regarding the feedback for the grant program, over the winter, or we knew we wanted to expand and include funding for used building materials. So I approached some architects and design firms over the winter and had conversations with them about some ideas of different ways, we could kind of approach the grant. And one of the thoughts was doing more of like a rebate that would be directly with retailers. And we kind of backtracked from that and went the route we have currently proposed, which is similar criteria to the deconstruction grant program, which I had mentioned will have like minimum materials coming out. And this kind of provides more variety of projects that could be funded where, maybe it's not all the materials aren't being sourced from a salvage outlet necessarily, but maybe from another project, up at their cabin or something is an example. But then we kind of took that more conversational feedback and put out a survey to about 75 different folks from architect firms, designers, different local governments, past grantees to get feedback, and adjusted our guidelines a little bit, knowing that they thought the lumber requirement might be a little tough. So we changed that from 1,000 pounds of lumber to 500 for this portion. And we're kind of viewing the used building material installation funds as a pilot. So I think, definitely we'll see how this goes for the rest of 2022 and make changes, as necessary. And a note too that all of these different tiers are coming out of one pot of money. So depending on, I'm really hoping we will get good responses and spend all of it and, be able to request more funds to continue to fund more projects. And I did want to note too, I know I talked about this more at the first session, that the structural move grants, we have up to $15,000 worth of funding. And that project, or we funded one project over the winter, and that really came out of like one champion who saw this property that was slated for demo for redevelopment, and really took a lot of time, energy, and financial contributions to move this. So the question of like, how do we all or nothing approach? I think it's giving support and voices to those champions. And he received $5,000 of our grant funds and was really a huge part in increasing our funding for $15,000 from that project. And then my final note is that our used building material installation funds can be used in conjunction with the other grant funds. So you could deconstruct or do a house move, but then also get the used material funds to bring old materials and salvage materials back into them. So yeah, we're looking forward to continuing to get feedback and make improvements as we need it. Thanks for that question.
That's awesome, Olivia. Thank you. And I see Madeline's question about emerging architecture professionals, which is a great point. And I don't know if it's explicitly architecture, but Melissa here on this call could probably speak to, well, we're running out of time too, but Melissa has been advising a capstone course in the Sustainable Systems Management program. I think I got that right, at the U, which I don't think is an architecture. I think it's something else, but is they're doing a study about a building on campus that and measuring the potential impacts of demolishing, deconstructing, and renovating the building. So there, I think we're like seeing a lot of different potential inroads with current students entering the field, and as we've said, I think the world of architecture is coming to terms with the fact that the construction industry is a huge player in this and needs to be considering salvage and reuse wherever possible. So, oh, thank you, Melissa. Perfect. We have the link. Okay. Excellent. Well, we're at noon, and I just want to thank Ian, Erin, Fitzie, and Olivia for excellent presentations and perspectives about this work. Thank you all for participating in this, especially those of you, well, no one's more special than anybody else, but especially those of you who stick through 6 hours of the Deconstruction Masterclass. I really appreciate the support and participation in this program. You will be hearing from me tomorrow with the recording, links from the chat, and other resources. So I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.